They're just waiting for the old hag to die. That's what Lisa said. I was carrying a tray of lemon scones into the living room when I heard her, her voice bright and careless, floating above the laughter of her friends. I don't think she even lowered it. Why would she? In her mind, I was already fading, half blind, half deaf, half alive. She said it like a joke, like a little puff of air to amuse the women gathered around her new marble table. We're just waiting for the old hag to die, she repeated, and the sound of their laughter swelled, polished, rehearsed, the kind of laughter people use to fill silence before it can grow teeth. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't gasp or slam a door. I just set the scones down quietly, as if I hadn't heard a thing, and straightened the doily under the plate. My hands didn't shake, but my chest did something strange. A deep tightening that felt older than grief and colder than anger. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was the moment I realized that after all the years I spent raising their children, cooking their meals, keeping their house clean and quiet, I had become background noise, a woman-shaped piece of furniture, and now, apparently, an obstacle to inheritance. I'm 82 years old. I live now by the sea, in a little house with green shutters that need painting and a garden that refuses to behave. But that day, when those words first hit me, I was still in their perfect suburban home, the one I helped pay for, though no one remembers that part. The air smelled of disinfectant and rosemary candles, everything curated to look effortless. I had been living with them for nearly 2 years by then, ever since my hip surgery, ever since Adam, my son, my only child, insisted it would be simpler for me to stay with them until I got back on my feet. Simpler, he said. For whom, he never clarified. At first, I told myself it was kindness. That was before the small corrections began. Lisa reminding me to wear slippers so I wouldn't scratch the floors, to keep my things in my room, to ask first before using the oven because she had a system. The house had rules I was never told, but always broke. And through it all, Adam stayed quiet, polite, distant, the way men become when they've chosen peace with their wives over truth with their mothers. That afternoon, Lisa was hosting what she called her book club, though I never once saw a book. They sat in a semicircle of white chairs that looked too fragile to hold real conversation, sipping white wine and discussing cleanses, investments, and someone's troublesome mother-in-law. I brought the scones because it seemed expected, because that's what I've always done. Feed people who don't see me. When I heard her voice slice through the air, I froze behind the kitchen door. She's healthy enough, Lisa said. But you know how it goes. One fall, one infection. We're just waiting for the old hag to die. I don't remember how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe minutes. Time thickened. I could hear the clink of glass, the clatter of bracelets, the soft rustle of someone shifting uncomfortably, but not enough to object. No one defended me. Why would they? I wasn't in the room, and to defend the invisible is to risk becoming invisible yourself. I walked to the sink, turned on the tap, let the water run until it drowned everything else. My reflection in the window above it was blurred, ghostly. I looked like what she had called me. Something old? Something waiting? I whispered the word under my breath just once to feel it roll in my mouth. Hag. It didn't fit. It wasn't my name. My name was Evelyn Margaret Cole. I had been a nurse for 35 years, a wife for 42, a mother for 57, and somehow none of that seemed to matter anymore. I turned off the tap, dried my hands, and walked out of the kitchen. When Lisa saw me, she smiled, her lips stretching too wide. "Oh, Evelyn," "We didn't hear you," she said, voice syrupy with false warmth. "We were just talking about you, about how strong you are." I nodded, because that's what women like me are taught to do when insult dresses itself as flattery. I said nothing. I just poured myself a cup of tea, sat at the corner of the room, and listened as if I were a guest in someone else's life. When the women finally left, Lisa came into the kitchen humming softly, wiping the counter that was already spotless. "You didn't have to serve today, you know," she said without looking at me. "You should rest more." Her tone carried that sharp sweetness I'd come to recognize, the kind that tells you the conversation is not a request. "I like feeling useful," I replied. She shrugged. "Well, don't overdo it. You're not 20 anymore." I almost laughed at that. I hadn't been 20 since before she was born, but somehow she'd decided I should apologize for the crime of surviving longer than her comfort required. That night, I sat in my small room at the end of the hallway, the one they called the guest room, though I had lived there for 2 years, and looked at the photographs on my dresser. There was Adam at 10, holding the model airplane we built together. Adam, at 17, at his graduation. None of those versions of him would have stood by and let his wife call his mother a hag. I wondered when he had learned to stop hearing me. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 11:47 in sterile blue light. I thought about the house. Mine once, then his, now theirs. And about the quiet rearrangements of power that happen so slowly you almost don't notice until you realize you no longer have a key to your own life. I didn't sleep. I listened to the pipes whisper through the walls, the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the faint giggle of Lisa's voice from their bedroom as she scrolled through her phone. I thought of all the years I'd spent making sure Adam never went to bed hungry, of the nights I worked double shifts so he could go to university, of the house I sold to help him with the down payment for this one. And now, to her friends, I was an expiration date, a ticking clock they were waiting out. The next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, she was there, already dressed in one of those beige sweaters that cost more than my monthly pension. She greeted me with a bright, "Good morning," and offered me tea. Her cheerfulness was a shield, and I had no energy left to pretend not to see it. I sat down, stirred my cup, and said quietly, "Lisa, I heard what you said yesterday." She froze, just for a heartbeat. Then she smiled again, tighter this time. "Oh? What did I say?" "You called me an old hag," I said, evenly, without drama. "You said you were waiting for me to die." The silence that followed was like static. She looked at me, eyes flickering, calculating. "Oh, Evelyn, that was a joke," she said finally, her voice trembling between irritation and fear. "You took that out of context." I nodded slowly. "I see. And what's the context for wishing someone dead?" She didn't answer. She just sighed, exasperated, as if I were being difficult. "You really shouldn't take things so personally." "I am a person," I said. "So yes, I take it personally." Adam walked in halfway through, bleary-eyed, half listening. "What's going on?" he asked. Lisa was quicker. "Your mother's upset about something she overheard, but it's really nothing, just gossip." He rubbed his temples. "Mom, Lisa jokes sometimes. Don't take it seriously, okay?" I looked at him then, really looked, and understood that he wasn't defending her. He was protecting himself from having to choose. That was the day I stopped hoping for him to choose me. After breakfast, I put on my coat and walked into town. The air was sharp, the kind that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. I stopped at the lawyer's office without planning to. It was a small building I'd passed 100 times and never entered. The brass letters on the door read, Gordon and Wells, Estate and Family Law. Inside smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. The receptionist asked if I had an appointment. I said, no, but I'd like to change my will. She looked startled, then nodded. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man in a gray suit who reminded me faintly of my late husband. Careful, tired, kind around the eyes. He asked if there was a particular urgency. Yes, I said, before someone else decides my worth for me. When I walked back home, the sky had shifted to that washed-out gold before rain. The house gleamed in its perfection, cold and self-satisfied. Lisa was on the phone in the living room, her voice low and pleasant. She didn't see me. I stood there for a long moment, watching her silhouette against the pale drapes, and realized that the word home no longer belonged to me there. That realization was oddly freeing. The pain was clean, not festering. I went to my room, opened my drawer, and took out the only thing that still felt like mine, a photograph of Adam as a little boy, holding my hand in the park, smiling up at me as if I were the whole world. I touched the edge of the frame. I hope, I whispered, you remember who I was before she told you what I am. That night, I packed a small suitcase. Just clothes, medicine, and the red notebook I'd started keeping long ago, filled with tiny notes about each humiliation, each moment of quiet erasure that had gone unnoticed by everyone except me. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for, only that I wasn't going to wait anymore. Not for their laughter, not for their permission, and certainly not for death. When I turned off the light, the room fell into soft darkness, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was disappearing. I felt awake. I felt alive, and I knew something irreversible had begun. The defining moment came 3 days after the laughter. I had gone about those days as if nothing had happened, moving softly through the house, performing the small courtesies that had long since replaced affection. I made breakfast, folded towels, watered the plants, and stayed invisible on purpose. That's how women like me survive when we sense danger. We become quiet. We listen. We take note. But I could feel something shifting in the air, a new chill beneath the surface of their politeness. Lisa had grown sharper in tone, faster to correct me. The words, "Don't worry about it, Evelyn," began to mean, "Stay out of it." She was locking away more of the cupboards, for safety, as she called it. And one afternoon, I discovered that even my medication had been moved to a labeled box high on the shelf. When I asked why, she said, "It's just better if I manage it. You don't want to mix things up at your age." My age. A phrase that had begun to sound like a verdict. That same evening, I overheard Adam talking on the phone in the next room, his voice low, calm, deferential. "No, she's fine," he said. "Just, old." A pause, a small laugh. "It won't be long." That was the moment the seed of clarity split open inside me. I understood that I was no longer family in that house. I was an obstacle to be managed. Every smile, every polite remark, every glass of water left by my bedside was a ritual of waiting. And it wasn't death they were waiting for, not really. It was freedom from gratitude, from obligation, from the mirror of their own smallness. They wanted the story where the old woman quietly disappeared and the young couple inherited the house, untarnished, untroubled. The cruelest thing is that I would have given them everything anyway, if only they had been kind. But kindness had become too costly for them. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the world outside still a blur of gray. I dressed slowly, the way you do when you're not sure yet whether you're leaving or staying. I made coffee, strong and black, and drank it standing by the window. The garden was wet with dew, and the first sparrows were picking at the feeder I had filled the night before. There was a strange peace in that moment, a kind of resignation mixed with resolve. I realized that I had been waiting too, not for death, but for a reason to reclaim myself. Lisa had given me that, unintentionally, with her careless cruelty. Sometimes the key to a locked door is the insult you can't forget. After breakfast, Adam left for work, kissing Lisa absently on the temple while scrolling through his phone. He didn't even glance in my direction. Lisa was at the counter, arranging fresh tulips in a vase. "We'll be having some people over this weekend," she said, without looking up. "It might be better if you stayed upstairs or went out for a bit, just so you're comfortable." The phrasing was exquisite, exclusion disguised as care. "Comfortable," she said, as if my comfort had ever mattered. I smiled faintly. "I'll make myself scarce," I replied. "Good," she said, relieved. "I knew you'd understand." I understood too well. I went upstairs to my room and sat on the bed for a long time. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of Lisa's heels on the tile floor below, that sharp echo of ownership. I took out my red notebook and began to write, not in anger, but in precision. I recorded every word, every slight, every act of control she had performed since I moved in. I described the laughter, the insult, the way Adam had laughed on the phone. It wasn't revenge I was planning. It was record-keeping, the oldest defense of women who have no witnesses. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it under my pillow. Then I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out an old manila envelope, the copy of the will I had written 15 years ago when Adam first married Lisa. Back then, it had been simple. Everything to my son, with the understanding that he would do what was right. How foolish that word sounded now. Understanding. There is no understanding in inheritance, only appetite and pretense. At 11, I called my lawyer again. His secretary remembered me. "I'd like to come in today," I said. "It's urgent." There was a pause, then a quiet kindness in her voice. "We can make time for you at 2. I took the bus into town. I hadn't ridden one in years, and the motion of it, the hum of the engine, the chatter of strangers, felt unexpectedly freeing. No one looked at me. No one knew my name. I was simply another passenger, not someone's responsibility, not someone's embarrassment. At the law office, Mr. Gordon greeted me with a nod and gestured toward the same chair I'd sat in before. "You've made your decision?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Completely." He handed me the forms, and I began to dictate. The house was to go to Claire Hastings, my goddaughter, who had nursed me through pneumonia 5 years ago, visiting on her days off with homemade soup and conversation that had no pity in it. I trusted her, not because she was family, but because she saw me as a whole person. I left a modest sum to Kieran, my eldest grandson, the only one who still wrote letters instead of texts. Everything else, the jewelry, the savings bonds, the small investments I had hidden from Adam's eager arithmetic, would be divided between 2 charities, a women's legal aid fund and a hospice program I had volunteered for decades ago. When Mr. Gordon looked up from his notes, he studied my face for a moment. "Do you want to include your son at all?" he asked gently. "No," I said. "He already has what he wanted." My silence, He hesitated, then nodded. The paperwork took an hour. I signed every page with a steady hand, not because I wasn't shaken, but because I wanted my handwriting to be legible proof that I had been fully present. When we finished, he asked if I wanted a witness from his office to notarize immediately. Yes, I said. Today. There was no tomorrow in what I was doing. Only now. When I left, the sun had come out weakly from behind the clouds, casting that pale winter light that makes everything look honest. I stopped by a bakery on the way home and bought a small loaf of sourdough, still warm from the oven. The girl behind the counter smiled without knowing she had just handed me the first thing I'd chosen for myself in months. On the walk back, I took the long way, past the park where mothers pushed strollers and old men argued over chess. I wondered if Lisa would even notice how long I'd been gone. Probably not. The powerful rarely notice the quiet exits of the people they exploit. When I reached the house, the front door was locked from the inside. I rang the bell twice before she opened it, her face a practiced mask of concern. "Evelyn, you didn't tell me you were going out. You should leave a note." Her voice trembled with that counterfeit worry that hides irritation. "I'm not a child," I said simply. "I went to see my lawyer." Her eyebrows flicked up, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine fear. "Your lawyer?" she repeated, trying to sound casual. "Everything all right?" "Perfectly," I said, stepping past her. She smelled of expensive perfume, cold and metallic. "Just taking care of unfinished business." I went upstairs without explaining further. I could feel her eyes on my back like the prickle of static. In my room, I sat at the desk and opened the window. The air smelled faintly of rain. I unfolded the new documents, read them once more, then tucked them carefully into the red notebook. For years, my life had been reduced to small routines. But now there was a pulse again, a direction. It wasn't happiness yet, but it was clarity. And clarity is the first mercy after humiliation. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to Adam, not to Lisa, but to Kieran. I didn't mention the insult or the will. I only told him that I was proud of him, that I hoped he was reading good books, that sometimes the people who claim to love us are only rehearsing ownership. I ended it with a line from an old poem I once loved. "We are not born to wait for kindness. We must invent it." I sealed the letter and left it on my dresser to mail the next morning. Later, when the house had gone quiet, I heard Lisa and Adam talking downstairs. The walls carried their voices up the stairwell in faint, distorted tones. "She went to a lawyer," Lisa said, tight and hushed. "Why would she do that?" Adam mumbled something I couldn't catch, and then Lisa's voice rose again, brittle. "She's confused, Adam. She's starting to imagine things." A pause. "We might need to get something in writing, just in case." That phrase, "just in case," echoed through me like a bell. I realized they were already preparing to erase me, to make my lucidity a liability. It was almost funny, the way people panic when the person they've written off refuses to disappear on schedule. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling the quiet thrum of my heart, steady, alive. I wasn't afraid anymore. Their house was a museum of control, but the will in my drawer was real, and it was mine. I had thought revenge would taste sweet, but it didn't. It tasted like fresh air after too many years breathing someone else's perfume. I had done what I came to do. The rest would follow, in time. It was the following week when the quiet unraveling began, not through confrontation, but through the small, invisible tremors that run through a household when trust has died, but the pretense of civility must remain. Everything looked the same from the outside. The same manicured lawn, the same perfumed candles burning on the console table, the same careful orchestration of politeness at breakfast. But beneath it, the air had thickened, heavy with something unspoken. Lisa stopped calling me by my name. Instead, she used phrases like, "Could you do me a favor?" or "Would you mind?" or, worst of all, "Maybe you should rest." Adam, too, seemed to shrink into his routine, leaving earlier, coming home later, moving through the house like a man avoiding mirrors. It was as if they had reached a silent agreement. I would continue to breathe under their roof, but only as long as I didn't disturb the performance of their perfect life. The first escalation wasn't an argument. It was a reorganization of space. One morning, I found that the photographs I had kept on the small table in the hallway, pictures of Adam as a boy, of my late husband, of me holding Kieran when he was still a baby, had vanished. The frames were gone, the table empty except for a vase of artificial flowers that hadn't been there the night before. When I asked Lisa about them, she tilted her head in that way she did when pretending to be patient. "Oh, those. They were getting a little old and dusty. I thought I'd put them away for safekeeping." "Where exactly?" I asked, knowing the answer. She smiled faintly. "In the attic, I think. Don't worry, I'll label the box for you." There was no malice in her tone, only that polished indifference that's worse than cruelty, because it comes from someone who has already decided you no longer count as real. At dinner, Adam said nothing. I could tell he'd been told to stay quiet, to let her handle it. He chewed methodically, nodded when spoken to, and avoided my eyes. I watched his hands, the same hands that once gripped mine when he was learning to walk, when he had begged me not to let go, and wondered when he had learned to release everything that mattered so easily. I didn't speak either. There's a certain dignity in silence, though it burns as it's kept. Later that evening, I went upstairs and opened my wardrobe. The top shelf was nearly empty. My winter coat, the one I had owned for a decade, the one that had followed me through the hospital corridors and grocery lines and Sunday walks, was gone. In its place was a sleek beige jacket, with a tag still attached. Lisa's doing, of course. A replacement for something that didn't fit her image of me. When I asked, she said, "Oh, that old coat was so worn. I donated it. You'll look so much more elegant in this." Elegant, as if I were an accessory she had decided to upgrade. I nodded, thanked her quietly, then went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. The new coat folded neatly across my lap. It smelled faintly of plastic and someone else's idea of cleanliness. Over the next few days, I began to notice more disappearances. The chipped teacup my husband once repaired with glue, the crocheted throw I'd made after my surgery, even the stack of old recipe cards I kept in the kitchen drawer. Decluttering, Lisa called it. Streamlining the space. She said it with such effortless conviction that even Adam repeated it once or twice, as though he'd memorized the phrase from her lips. I watched them redesign their world without me in it, piece by piece, and it was strange how the loss of objects hurt less than the loss of air, the quiet suffocation that comes from being tolerated instead of loved. But cruelty never stays contained. It always leaks. The first public crack appeared one afternoon at a family lunch. Adam's colleagues and their wives were visiting, and Lisa had laid out a perfect spread of salads and sparkling water, the kind of meal meant to look healthy and modern. I had baked a quiche early that morning, out of habit more than anything, and set it on the counter to cool. When the guests arrived, I offered to slice it, but Lisa intercepted, laughing softly. "Oh, Evelyn, that's sweet, but the kitchen's a bit crowded. Why don't you sit and enjoy yourself?" She took the quiche, placed it on the far counter, and never served it. When the guests complimented the food, she smiled and said, "Thank you. I try to keep things light. You know how older recipes can be. Heavy." Everyone laughed politely, not realizing that the older recipe was me. That night, when the house was quiet, I retrieved the quiche from the fridge. It was untouched, cold, congealed, but still smelled faintly of thyme and butter. I cut a small slice, reheated it, and ate it standing by the sink. The taste was ordinary, but it grounded me, a reminder that I still knew how to make something worth savoring, even if they didn't. Sometimes survival is as simple as eating what others discard. The following week brought the second rearrangement. Lisa began to lock certain doors. First the liquor cabinet, then the medicine drawer, then the study, where the financial papers were kept. "You know how forgetful things can get," she said, smiling, when I asked about the new locks. "We just don't want any mix-ups." Mix-ups. As if my mind had started leaking. I had been a nurse for 3 decades, trained to notice the smallest changes in patients' conditions, to remember medication schedules down to the minute. But to her, I was already slipping into the fog of senility. She said it often enough that Adam started to believe it. Once, when I reminded him about his father's old watch, something he had promised to repair but never did, he looked at me with mild pity and said, "Mom, that was years ago. We don't have that anymore." But I'd seen it on his wrist 2 weeks earlier. The erasure had become mutual now, a collaboration between comfort and cowardice. Then came the conversation that confirmed what I had suspected since the day at the lawyer's office. One evening, as I was coming downstairs for tea, I heard them talking in the living room. They didn't hear me. Lisa's voice was low, taut with frustration. "She's been going through papers again. I saw her reading something by the window." "What papers?" Adam asked. "I don't know, but it worries me. She's been unpredictable lately." "Unpredictable how?" "She goes out without telling us, makes phone calls, writes letters. I think she's hiding things." Adam sighed. "Lisa, she's old, not dangerous." "You don't understand," she snapped. "If she changes anything, if she does something stupid, it could complicate everything." There was a pause. Then his voice again, weary. "What do you want me to do?" "Talk to her," she said. "Remind her that we're here to take care of her." I heard the faint clink of a glass being set down, then the murmur of something softer. Maybe an apology, maybe nothing at all. I walked back upstairs before they could see me, the tea forgotten. That night I couldn't sleep. The walls seemed to pulse with their voices, echoing in my head like a warning. I realized that what they called care was simply control dressed in soft words. I thought of the word guardian, how close it sits beside warden. The next morning, I packed a small canvas bag. My identification papers, my notebook, a few clothes, and the copy of the will. I didn't plan to run, not yet, but I wanted to feel ready. Readiness is a kind of freedom in itself. Lisa noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything that threatened her version of order. "Going somewhere?" she asked lightly when she saw the bag by my chair. "Just organizing," I said. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. "You've been restless lately. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Halpern about adjusting your medication." There it was, the first real warning. They would pathologize my defiance. Make it sound like confusion instead of clarity. I nodded and said nothing. Later, I wrote the date and her words in my notebook, underlined twice. Documentation is how the powerless build their fortress. Days bled together after that. The house seemed to grow smaller, its walls whispering with the sounds of a life that wasn't mine. I started taking long walks in the afternoon, pretending it was for exercise, though in truth, I needed to breathe somewhere that didn't smell of control. I'd sit on a park bench near the duck pond and watch the children play, their laughter raw and unguarded, the way Adam's used to be before the world taught him to measure affection in returns. Sometimes I'd think about leaving for good, but the thought felt heavy, premature, like walking away before you've packed what really matters. Still, each day I stayed away a little longer, and each evening I came home a little later. I was teaching myself how to disappear gradually, like a habit I meant to break. The real escalation came on a Wednesday. I had returned from one of my walks to find Lisa sitting at the dining table with my notebook open in front of her. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this?" she asked. I closed the door behind me carefully. "That's mine," I said. "You went through my things." "I was tidying," she said quickly, though her voice trembled. "And this fell out from under your pillow. You've been writing about us?" "I've been writing about my life," I said. "If that includes you, that's not my fault." Her composure cracked then, just slightly. "You shouldn't write things that aren't true. People could misunderstand." "People," I repeated. "You mean Adam." "I mean anyone," she snapped, then softened. "Look, Evelyn, I'm worried about you. This kind of behavior, it's not healthy. It makes people think you're paranoid." I looked at her and felt an almost surreal calm. "People who hide other people's property shouldn't use the word paranoid," I said. She flushed, then stood up abruptly. "Maybe it's time we got some help around here," she muttered. "Someone professional." That night, after they went to bed, I retrieved the notebook from the drawer where she had hidden it. I sat at my desk for hours, adding to it, recording every word of our exchange, every expression on her face, every small tremor in my own hands. I wrote until my fingers ached and my eyes blurred, until the fear inside me turned into something steadier, something close to resolve. They thought they could make me vanish quietly, fold me into the wallpaper of their curated life. But they had forgotten one simple truth. Women like me don't disappear. We record, we endure, and eventually, we act. The morning after Lisa read my notebook, the house seemed too quiet, as if even the walls had paused to listen for what I might do next. The air smelled of polished wood and lavender cleaner, the odor of control disguised as care. I made my coffee slowly, deliberately, aware that Lisa was sitting at the table pretending to read the newspaper, but not turning the pages. When I poured the water into the mug, I could feel her eyes on my back, sharp as a blade hidden in velvet. "Sleep well?" she asked. Her tone was mild, but every syllable was a test. "Eventually," I said. "Good," she murmured. "Adam and I were thinking, maybe it's time you had a little checkup. Just routine. It's been a while, hasn't it?" I turned to face her, holding the cup in both hands. "No," I said. "It hasn't been a while. I saw my doctor 2 months ago. He said I was in excellent shape for my age." She smiled tightly, that smile she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while drawing a line through someone's freedom. "Of course, but we just want to be sure you're not under any stress. You've been writing so much lately, staying up late. It's not good for you." I nodded slowly, taking a long sip of coffee. "You're right, Lisa," I said. "It's not good for me. so I think I'll go for a walk." I left before she could answer. The sun was high and pale, the kind of weak winter light that flatters nothing but still feels like a small mercy. My legs ached, but I didn't care. I walked all the way to the park, the same bench by the duck pond, where I'd begun to think of my future in fragments, tiny glimpses of a life without their voices echoing down the hallway. I sat there a long time, watching a boy feed the birds with his mother. He had the same dark hair Adam had at that age, the same careless joy in the way he moved. His mother laughed when the ducks squabbled, and I realized I hadn't laughed freely in years. The thought came to me not as bitterness, but as fact, as simple as the reflection of clouds on the pond's surface. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a participant in my own life and become a prop in someone else's story. The realization was both painful and liberating. I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook. The pages were heavy with ink, the handwriting small and deliberate, like footprints through a long field. It wasn't a diary anymore. It had become evidence, testimony, the only thing that proved I hadn't imagined what was happening. I reread the entries from the first weeks after I moved in, the small corrections, the patronizing kindness, the shrinking of my world one drawer, one comment, one locked door at a time. As I turned the pages, something inside me shifted. The anger that had been simmering quietly now hardened into something cleaner, sharper. For the first time, I wasn't writing to survive. I was writing to prepare. I thought of the will in my drawer, the one that had already sealed my intentions. It wasn't enough to have made the decision privately. I needed to act in a way that could not be rewritten or denied. I walked to the small post office near the market and bought a large envelope. Inside it, I placed photocopies of my new will, along with a letter addressed to my lawyer, confirming the final version and authorizing him to execute it immediately in the event of my death. I mailed it before I could second-guess myself. The metal flap clanged shut with a sound that felt almost ceremonial, like the closing of a gate. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of ink and dust and paper, and then stepped out into the street. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. When I returned home, the tension in the air had thickened into something visible. Lisa was in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, clipped, the tone of someone discussing a fragile problem. She ended the call the moment I entered. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Of course," she said too quickly. "Just scheduling something for next week." I nodded, hung my coat, and walked past her to my room. I locked the door, something I rarely did, and sat by the window. The garden below looked brittle in the afternoon light. The rose bushes I had planted when I first moved in were still there, though Lisa never watered them. They were overgrown now, but stubbornly alive. I saw in them a small reflection of myself, unkempt, underestimated, still blooming against neglect. That evening, Adam came home earlier than usual. He knocked on my door before dinner, a rare courtesy. When I opened it, he stood there looking uncertain, his tie loosened, his hair mussed from running a hand through it too many times. "Mom," he began, "Lisa said you've been upset lately. Is something wrong?" His voice was gentle, rehearsed, the same tone he used with his children when he needed compliance. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." "You know we worry about you," he said. "It's not easy for you here, I get that, but we're trying. Lisa's trying." I almost laughed. "Trying what, Adam? To make me invisible?" He sighed. "Please don't start. She's been under a lot of stress. And I'm her stress relief, apparently. He frowned. You're twisting everything into the worst possible version. No one means any harm. Then why does it feel like harm? I asked quietly. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, You always read too much into things. You've done that since I was a kid. The sentence landed like a cold slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was so effortless, so unthinking. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He just couldn't see that he already had. At dinner, Lisa talked about redecorating the guest room, my room. She described new wallpaper, lighter curtains, a small writing desk by the window. It'll be so much brighter, she said, glancing at me briefly. Something fresh. I nodded. That sounds lovely, I said, though the subtext was clear. She was preparing for a future where I was no longer there. After the meal, I offered to wash the dishes, but she waved me away. I've got it, she said, her voice sweet and brittle. I went upstairs and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the faint sound of running water below. The house felt foreign, and yet every piece of it still bore my fingerprints, my memories, my quiet labor. It struck me then how easy it is to be erased when you've spent your life building comfort for others. That night, I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting at the kitchen table of our old house, the one that smelled of cinnamon and damp leaves, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled, the way he always did when he wanted to reassure me. You always think too much, he said. But it wasn't a rebuke. It was fondness. When I woke, my pillow was damp, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was sweat or tears. The room was gray with early light. I made a decision before I even swung my legs out of bed. I was going to find a place of my own, even if it was a single room above a laundromat, even if it meant starting again with nothing. The next day, after they both left for work, I opened the old address book I kept in the drawer. Most of the names had been crossed out or marked deceased, but one caught my eye. Marianne Lewis. We had worked together at the hospital 30 years ago. I remembered her laugh, her blunt kindness. I called the number, half expecting it to be disconnected, but she answered on the third ring, her voice older, but unmistakably hers. Evelyn. My God, it's been years. I told her I just wanted to hear a friendly voice. We talked for an hour about nothing and everything, retirement, lost husbands, the small indignities of age. When I mentioned that I might be looking for a place, she said, I've got a friend, Nora, who rents rooms to women our age. Nothing fancy, but safe and clean. Want me to ask? I hesitated for only a moment before saying yes. That afternoon, Marianne called back with the address. It was across town, near the old library. I took the bus the next day under the pretense of running errands. The house was small, 2 stories, paint peeling, but the front garden was filled with violets and thyme. Nora herself opened the door, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a cigarette balanced between her fingers. You're the one Marianne sent? She asked. I am. You clean? Quiet? Pay on time? Yes to all 3. She nodded. Then you can have the upstairs room. Week to week, cash. No drama. That suits me fine. When I left, I had a key in my pocket and something I hadn't felt in years, a plan. It wasn't dramatic. There would be no confrontation, no scene. I would simply begin to remove myself, one piece at a time. I would move my things slowly, quietly, while they were distracted with their dinner parties and their book clubs. The first step would be the documents and the notebook, then the small box of jewelry that had belonged to my mother. I would leave behind the furniture, the dishes, the polite role of the grateful dependent. Let them keep the house they'd coveted so badly. I would take the one thing they couldn't see or steal: myself. When I returned that evening, Lisa was in the living room sorting mail. She looked up and smiled, but her eyes flicked to the bag I was carrying. "You've been out a lot lately," she said casually. "Making friends?" "Something like that," I said. "Good for you," she replied, though I could hear the suspicion under the praise. She had begun to sense that she was losing control, and it frightened her. I went to my room, closed the door, and exhaled slowly. The quiet was no longer oppressive. It was mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for permission to exist. I was simply existing, and that, I realized, was the beginning of my escape. It didn't take long for the house to sense my distance and begin to tighten its grip, the way a hand clenches when it realizes something precious is slipping through the fingers. And if the midpoint had been a quiet drawing of breath, then what followed was the long, strained exhale of people who finally admit to themselves that they are losing the thing they have been pretending to own. Because within days of getting the key to Nora's place, I started moving in the only way women my age know how to move without causing alarm, which is to say, I shifted the weight of my life by ounces. Papers first, then photographs flattened between sweaters, then the small jewelry box that was my mother's, each removal disguised as laundry or tidying or a harmless trip to the post office. And at first, Lisa did not notice, which almost disappointed me, because I had expected her to feel the subtraction like a draft under a door. Yet when she finally did, the response was not fury, but choreography, a careful sequence of gestures designed to restore the performance. And she began with concern, that soft instrument she played so well, by asking with her voice turned just slightly down, "Are you sleeping at all, Evelyn? You seem a bit forgetful lately." Which was followed the next morning by a calendar invite slid across the table with a smile that showed the edges of her teeth. "I took the liberty of scheduling Dr. Halpern for a home visit. It will be easier for you." And then Adam, dear, careful Adam, added the sugar coating as he buttered his toast, telling me it was only to make sure I was comfortable, that we all get overwhelmed, and who could blame me after such a long life of responsibilities? And I nodded, because I have learned that sometimes the quickest way out of a trap is to let the person setting it believe you never saw the string. Dr. Halpern arrived with the gentle gait of a man who has been paid to be both physician and witness, his bag polished, his expression arranged in that neutral sympathy they teach in medical school for difficult families. And he asked me questions that were easy to answer if you had nothing to hide, and even easier if you had been a nurse for 35 years. So I told him today's date, and the name of the president, and the address of the house where I did not belong. And then I named the medications in my little box downstairs with dosages and purposes, and the two interactions no one seems to remember until the patient is sick. And when he asked about mood, I looked him in the eye and said that my mood was appropriate to my environment, which is to say it fluctuated between grief and outrage, but that I had a plan, and plans, in my experience, are better for mental health than diagnoses. And he nodded, perhaps because the stethoscope hears more truth than the mouth. Yet when he finished and stepped into the hallway with Adam and Lisa, I heard the low murmur of phrases designed to live in paperwork: age-appropriate forgetfulness, family support, monitor for safety. So I returned to my room and wrote those phrases down, because paper remembers what men prefer to soften. The next escalation did not come from medicine, but from the ruthless efficiency of a woman who has decided that narrative is everything. Because 2 days after the doctor had left, Lisa arranged what she called a light gathering, a few friends for coffee, nothing stressful, and I could have stayed upstairs and spared myself the spectacle. But I chose to sit at the edge of the room with my knitting and my patience and watch her orchestrate the conversation toward the pity she craved. And when one of the women asked how things were going at home, this home that had become a stage, Lisa sighed that elegant sigh of the burdened and said that caretaking is a blessing, but complicated, that older adults can become confused, and it is heartbreaking when they imagine slights that never happened. And I waited for Adam to interject, to correct the script, to say that his mother was not confused but insulted, except he was not there. And even if he had been there, I suspect his silence would have arrived early. And what saved me from an explosion was the small vibration in my pocket, a text from an unknown number that simply read, "Check your email." And when I excused myself and opened the message in the solitude of the upstairs hallway, I found an audio file attached, the subject line unsigned, the body empty, and I pressed play with the strange calm of a woman who has already guessed the plot and only needs the proof. And there it was, Lisa's voice from the week before, the laughter bright and merciless, the sentence intact with all its airless certainty. "We're just waiting for the old hag to die," followed by the chorus of approval that had branded my skin from the inside, and under that, like a ghost in the machine, another voice, younger, uncertain, not part of the party, whispering to someone on another end, "I'm recording this. Dad's going to deny it." And I knew the timbre before the name arrived, because love is an archivist and catalogs voices forever. And it was Kieran, my grandson, who still sends letters, the boy with the careful eyes who has always noticed the seam where truth is stitched to appearances. I stood there in the narrow hallway with my phone pressed to my ear and listened twice, 3 times, each repetition sanding down the raw edge of doubt until only the polished surface of certainty remained. And then I went back downstairs and made tea for myself and no one else. And when Lisa said brightly that she was telling her friends about the memory care options in our area, I told her that if she wanted to test the reach of her memory, she could recall exactly what she had said a week ago and who had heard it. And perhaps it was the directness of my tone or the uninvited presence of the word who, but her face changed the way a sky changes before hail. And later that evening, Adam found me folding laundry and told me in a voice that pretended exhaustion that recording people without their knowledge is a violation, and that Kieran is impressionable and has always been too close to me. And I folded a towel and handed it to him and said that when proximity is the only safety a child has, closeness is not a flaw, but a lifeline. The next day, the mailbox brought a new tactic, a glossy envelope addressed to resident, containing a community paper that had never before found our stoop. And on page 3, a photograph of me from 5 years ago at a charity bake sale, holding a pie with the careful smile of a woman who still believed decency could be banked like savings, and beneath it, a headline that managed to be both theatrical and bland. "Beloved grandmother missing. Family seeks answers." And I laughed aloud in that ugly, liberating way that sounds like a sob, translated, because the only thing missing in that story was honesty, and the quotes were a parade of soft lies. Lisa speaking of her concern, and Adam asking for privacy, and the word vulnerable repeated as if it were a charm that could turn greed into virtue. And I cut the article out with kitchen scissors and pasted it into my red notebook with a note in the margin that read, "People become worried when their supply lines are threatened." Then I made myself a sandwich and ate it with relish, because appetite returns when you stop mistaking humiliation for duty. Pressure accrued in increments after that, the way snow layers itself into weight sufficient to break a roof. And within a week, a man in a navy suit appeared at the cafe, where I sometimes took my afternoon coffee, introducing himself as a friend of the family, his card clean and overconfident, his voice designed for rooms where women are expected to agree. And he asked if we could discuss a few small matters regarding my estate and my well-being, perhaps at the house to keep me comfortable. And I told him that comfort is a bedroom door that locks, and that any matters regarding my estate had been settled with people who did not treat me as a hurdle race. And when he tried again with, "No one wants conflict," I said that conflict is the name we give to the moment when the hidden plan meets a woman who remembers her own signature. And he left with his card still on the table and the bill unpaid, which told me more about his employers than any speech he could have delivered. That night, I packed not ounces, but pounds. A small suitcase with my winter clothes, the photographs that still restored me to myself, the recipe box with its grease stains and penciled amendments, the letter from Kieran that came 2 summers ago when he was 17 and suddenly grown in his sentences. And I took a cab across town to Nora's and carried the suitcase up the stairs, one breath at a time, while she watched from the doorway with that clinical affection women acquire after a long life of triage. And she said nothing until I set the case on the bed, and then she nodded once and said that the kettle was on, and the rent could wait until the weekend. And we sat at her kitchen table with chipped mugs and 3 cookies that pretended to be 4, and for an hour we did not discuss my son or Lisa or the article or the man with the card. We discussed violets and the neighbor's ridiculous wind chime and whether the new bus line would ruin the quiet. And I felt the muscles between my shoulders release for the first time in months, a private unclenching that felt like a rehearsal for later relief. I did not announce my move because there is dignity in choosing the audience for your own exit. Yet secrecy is never complete in a house run by a vigilant ego. And 2 days into this experiment, mornings at their place to avoid alarm, afternoons returning to Nora's, I walked back from the grocery store to find Lisa waiting on the front steps with her arms folded and a smile that was all enamel. And she asked lightly whether I had enjoyed my errands and whether I had remembered to bring my phone. And when I said yes, she asked to see it, not as a demand, but as a dare wrapped in concern. And I handed it over with the screen dark, and the recording file moved and backed up twice, and she scrolled and returned it with a look that said she had wanted a fight, and I had refused to audition. And that evening, Adam finally cracked enough to ask me whether I was angry with him, and I told him that anger requires expectation, and that my expectation had been put to bed with the same lullaby we use on children who cannot sleep, because they sense that the adults downstairs are speaking truths not meant for small ears. And to his credit, he did not pretend to understand. He only looked tired in the way men look when they have constructed a room and suddenly discover there are no doors. The second escalation found its sharpest edge when Lisa tried to turn my future into a clinical file. Because the morning after she failed to confiscate my phone, she scheduled what she called a family meeting with a social worker from an agency whose brochure featured soft focus photos of smiling elders in cardigans. And the social worker, a woman about my son's age with a practiced kindness, asked whether I ever felt unsafe, and whether I had trouble remembering instructions, and whether I trusted the people I lived with. And I said that my safety improved when my choices were respected, and that I remembered instructions perfectly when they did not contradict dignity, and that trust is a currency spent by both parties, and my account had been overdrawn. And I watched the social worker choose her next words with care, then turned to Adam and Lisa with a set of suggestions that to their ears must have sounded like neutrality, but to mine were a small victory, because she proposed a formal capacity evaluation by an independent geriatrician, not the house call they had arranged, and a written list of my rights within the home, including access to my medications and personal belongings, and a schedule agreed upon rather than imposed. And I almost felt sorry for Lisa when she realized the apparatus she had conjured to prove my decline had offered me a document instead. After the social worker left, the house went glacial, not in volume, but in temperature. And for a week, we moved around one another with the careful civility of people who know the next misstep will become evidence. And in that frost, I discovered a clarity I wish I had known earlier, which is that respect cannot be negotiated in whispered rooms where the goal is to keep furniture from scratching the floor. Respect must be built in acts that change the furniture altogether. So I began to spend my mornings at Nora's, telling Adam that I had joined a seniors exercise class and a reading group, both of which existed only in the sense that I exercised my right to read my own mail. And in the quiet of those mornings, I drafted letters, not accusations or explanations, but clean, spare sentences that drew borders where none had been. A note to Lisa that thanked her for her hospitality and informed her that all future discussion of my health would take place in writing. A note to Adam that told him I loved him, but would no longer participate in the kind of love that required amnesia. And a longer letter to Kieran that did not ask him to take sides, but reminded him that the truth is not a team sport. It is a light you keep polishing even when it blinds your family. The past, bored with waiting at the door, chose that week to walk in, wearing a coat that smelled of rain and memory. Because on a Thursday, when the sky had the color of old pewter, I ran into Thomas Reed outside the library. Thomas, who had been my almost once upon a time before I chose a steadier man and a different life. Thomas, whose wife had died 3 years ago, and who now moved through the world with the quiet astonishment of someone who keeps bumping into their own survival. And we stood on the pavement with our groceries cooling in our hands and laughed the gentle laugh of people testing whether the old language still belonged to them. And then we sat on a bench, and he told me about his garden. And I told him almost nothing, and somehow told him everything. And when I said that the cruelty of the young can be worse than the cruelty of strangers, because it asks you to disown your own history, he nodded, with that solemnity men wear when they wish they could fix what time has already soldered shut. And he said he had once been called a burden by his daughter, after he misplaced a set of keys, that the word had entered his chest like a small stone and never left. And I thought of Lisa's sentence, quick and shiny and lethal, and I felt the kinship of those who have been translated into objects in houses they paid for. Seeing Thomas did not alter my plans so much as it steadied my hand, because when someone who remembers your first name without a title says it kindly, you recall that you were a person before you were a parent. And that evening, I returned to Nora's and wrote the date of our meeting on a slip of paper I tucked into my recipe box, not as a romantic gesture, but as an archival instinct, because we deserve to preserve the moment when the world reminds us we exist outside the roles assigned by the least generous audience. And the next morning, I woke early and moved the last of my clothing across town, then wiped my dresser drawers with a damp cloth and left them open so Lisa could see the emptiness and decide whether it was loss or relief. And on the pillow, I placed a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences. I will not be here this weekend. Do not call the police. Call your conscience. Which in retrospect may have been theatrical, but theatrics are what you learn from living in someone else's play. Of course they called, not the police, but me, in a flurry of voicemails that choreographed their panic into a series of tones. Lisa's scolded concern, Adam's injured reasonableness, even a message from a number I did not recognize that turned out to be the man in the navy suit, reminding me that sudden moves can trigger legal complications. And I made tea in Nora's quiet kitchen and listened to each message once and then once again with the part of my brain that used to count respirations in the night. And when my phone finally rang with Kieran's name glowing like a small lighthouse, I answered. And he did not ask, "Where are you?" He asked, "Are you safe?" And I told him yes in the voice I used to use when he was small and woke from a dream. And he told me he had sent the recording to his own email, and then to mine, and then to a folder labeled "In Case They Lie." And I felt a pride so fierce it frightened me. Not because I had trained him to gather evidence, but because he had trained himself to tell the truth, even when the truth shakes the table. Pressure has a way of trying one last time before conceding, and their final attempt arrived folded into a brunch invitation printed on cardstock with embossed leaves, a family celebration to which I was invited, with the addendum that perhaps it would be best for all if we spoke beforehand about expectations. And I recognized the trap wrapped in etiquette and declined without explanation, which provoked the inevitable house call. Lisa on the doorstep on a rainy afternoon with her coat immaculate and her mascara born for weather, asking if she might come in to talk. And Nora, God bless women who learned their boundary lessons in the hard school, said the living room was fine, but the kitchen was for friends. And Lisa sat perched on the edge of the sofa like a ballerina forced to rest on a bus stop bench. And she spoke for 12 minutes without inhaling about reputation and misunderstanding, and how social workers can be so intrusive, and how articles can get details wrong. And then she tried tenderness, telling me she wanted us to start again, that she had been under pressure, that words can be strange creatures when they leave a mouth, and I waited until she was done. Then told her that I believed she loved my son in the way she understood love, which is to say, as a perimeter she must patrol, and that I wished her a long life full of parties, where she never needed to remove the old photographs to feel new, and that I would not be returning to a place where my continued breath was a logistical nuisance. And she blinked twice, not because I had been cruel, but because I had declined to be recruited into a confession I did not owe. When she stood to leave, she tried the last tool in her belt, which was the child in the shape of a question, asking whether I would at least attend the birthday next month because the children miss you. And I said that I would see Kieran when he chose to see me and the others when they wanted a grandmother and not a sponsor. And she almost smiled then, a brief concession to the fact that we had finally spoken plainly. And on the porch, she turned and said that I had always been formidable, which is a word women deploy when they need to honor what they cannot bend. And after she was gone, Nora lit a cigarette by the sink and said, "I like your word choices." And I laughed and told her I had been waiting decades to use them. The week ended with weather that smelled like endings and an envelope from Mr. Gordon confirming that all documents had been filed and witnessed and placed where signatures outlive the voices that would reinterpret them. And I sat at Nora's table with the letter in front of me and the recording backed up in 3 places and the key to my small room cooling on my palm. and I understood that escalation is not always shouting or broken plates. Sometimes it is a woman walking from one address to another with her name intact, while behind her a house hums in its curated quiet and begins to learn what an absence can do to a narrative that thought itself complete. And I knew then that the next move would be mine, and that it would not be a conversation or a plea. It would be the unglamorous, irreversible act of taking back the legal and ordinary facts of my life. And I slept that night, with the window cracked, and the smell of wet thyme rising like a small hymn, already stepping toward the door that would not open in both directions. The morning I decided to end it properly, end the long charade of their authority, end the quiet, rehearsed civility that had turned my life into a waiting room. I woke earlier than usual. Dawn had not yet reached full color, and the sky was still bruised with that heavy gray that sits between night and morning, the color of indecision. I sat up slowly in the narrow bed at Nora's, feeling the stiffness in my joints, the pulse of age that greeted me every day with the same whisper, "You're still here, so use it." I boiled water for tea and watched the steam rise like ghosts escaping the cup, thinking about all the things I had let evaporate in my life: time, dignity, names, laughter, and how this day, strange as it felt, would not be about revenge but about restoration. It was, in its own quiet way, my resurrection day, though no one would call it that. The world doesn't have words for old women who decide to reclaim what they gave away too generously. I dressed carefully, not for them, but for myself, in the blue wool dress I had kept at the very back of the closet, the one I had worn to my husband's funeral 30 years ago. It still fit, though the fabric had thinned a little around the elbows. I brushed my hair until it shone silver in the early light and pinned it back the way I used to when I worked the night shifts at the hospital, neat, practical, contained. There is a particular power in precision, especially when the world expects you to shake. I slipped the folded letter from my lawyer's envelope into my handbag, along with my identification and the copy of my will. My plan was not theatrical, not even particularly bold. It was simply final. I was going back to that house one last time, not to argue or explain, but to execute the act that would close the story I had allowed them to write over me. By the time I reached the neighborhood, the air had warmed slightly, carrying the smell of wet pavement and trimmed hedges. I walked up the path to the front door, that perfectly painted white door I had bought years ago when Adam and Lisa first moved in, and I paused before ringing the bell. Through the narrow window, I could see Lisa in the kitchen, dressed in her morning armor of beige and pearls, her back straight as she stirred something on the stove. She didn't see me at first. When she did, her whole body flinched just for a second before she recovered her posture and opened the door with that brittle smile. "Evelyn," she said, her tone trying to decide between surprise and suspicion, "we weren't expecting you." I stepped past her into the hall, setting my bag gently on the floor. "I didn't come to be expected," I said. "I came to finish something." Adam came down the stairs a few moments later, hair damp, tie loosened. He looked at me as if seeing a ghost, though I was more alive than I had been in years. "Mom, you should have called," he said automatically. "We could have—" I cut him off with a raised hand. "No, Adam, you've done enough arranging. I came to speak, and when I'm done, I'll go." The silence that followed was thick, like the air before a thunderstorm. Lisa folded her arms, leaning against the counter, her face unreadable. "If this is about that article," she began, "we didn't—" I stopped her too. It's not about the article. It's about the truth. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small recorder, and placed it on the table. You might remember this voice, I said, pressing play. Lisa's words filled the room again, crisp and clear, her laughter unmistakable. We're just waiting for the old hag to die. The sound of it echoed off the glass, off the polished walls, off Adam's silence. She went white. He went still. I let the full sentence play twice, then pressed stop. You see, I said, memory is a tricky thing. But recordings don't forget. They don't soften. They don't pretend it was a joke. Adam opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Mom, this doesn't... Don't, I said quietly. You don't need to defend her, or yourself. The words are there. They're not even the worst of it. The worst thing wasn't what she said. It was that you let it be said. He rubbed his forehead, the way he used to when he was a boy caught lying about something small, something harmless. But this was not harmless, and he was not a boy. Lisa found her voice first, brittle as glass. You can't just show up and start threatening us with recordings, she said. That's harassment. It's illegal to record people without consent. I smiled then, slowly, calmly. You're right. Maybe it is. Maybe you should call the police. I'd love to explain why I made the recording. I'd love to tell them what you said, how you treated me, how you moved my medication, how you tried to have me declared incompetent. Her mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't expected resistance to be this quiet, this clean. What do you want, Evelyn? She asked finally. Money? An apology? I shook my head. No, Lisa. I want nothing from you. That's the point. I've already taken it all back. I reached into my bag again and took out the envelope from Mr. Gordon. This, I said, laying it on the table, is my new will, signed, witnessed, filed, and beyond your reach. The house, the accounts, the bonds, none of it is yours. It never was. I've made sure of that. Adam sat down then, slowly, as if his legs had forgotten their purpose. You changed it? He said, more to himself than to me. You actually changed it. Yes, I said. The day I heard her say those words, that very afternoon. You see, when people tell you who they are, believe them. And I did. The clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill, cocked its head, and flew away again, indifferent to the human wreckage inside. Lisa straightened her shoulders, the fight draining from her face, replaced by something else. Calculation, perhaps, or fear. You can't just walk away from family like this, she said softly. We've taken care of you. I met her eyes. You took control of me, not care. Don't confuse the two. One keeps a person alive. The other keeps them useful. Then I turned to Adam, who still sat motionless at the table. I don't hate you, I said. You need to hear that before I go. I don't hate you. I pity you. Because someday you'll be old too, and you'll look into the eyes of someone who thinks your years are an inconvenience, and you'll remember this moment. And you'll understand. He didn't answer. He just looked away, his hands twisting in his lap. Lisa exhaled sharply, the sound of a woman who has realized the script no longer belongs to her. So what now? She asked. You ruin our lives? No, I said again, almost gently. You'll ruin them yourselves. I'm just leaving you to it. I picked up the recorder, the envelope, and my bag. I didn't slam the door. I closed it quietly behind me. Outside, the air felt clearer, thinner, like a lung uncoiling after years of compression. I walked down the path, and halfway to the street, I heard the sound of the door opening again. It was Adam. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking on the word. I stopped, turned, waited. "I didn't mean for it to get like this." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." He took a step forward, but I lifted a hand. "Don't follow. This isn't a punishment. It's a boundary." He nodded, but his eyes were wet. "Will I see you again?" he asked. "That depends," I said, "on whether you ever learn to see me at all." I walked away before he could answer. The street was quiet, except for the low hum of a lawnmower somewhere in the distance. My feet found their rhythm on the pavement, steady and unhurried. Every step felt deliberate, as if I were writing my name back into the ground. When I reached the corner, I looked back once, not at the house, but at the sky above it. It was clearing now, the gray lifting, a thin blue line spreading like a promise. For the first time in years, I did not feel like someone leaving home. I felt like someone arriving. At the lawyer's office, Mr. Gordon greeted me with a knowing smile. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again so soon," he said. "You will for the last time," I replied. "I just came to deliver this." I handed him the recorder and the copy of the letter I had written to accompany it. "If anything happens to me, if anyone tries to claim otherwise about my capacity or my choices, this goes to the authorities, and to the press, if necessary." He nodded solemnly, his professionalism softening into respect. "You've thought of everything," he said. "No," I corrected him. "I've remembered everything. There's a difference." When I stepped back outside, the afternoon light had shifted to gold, warm and forgiving. I walked without destination for a while, through streets where no one knew my name, and for the first time, that anonymity felt like freedom. I stopped at a small bakery and bought a loaf of bread, still warm, its crust cracking beneath my fingers. I carried it under my arm, the way I used to when Adam was small, when life had been simple and trust had been a currency we all believed infinite. And then I went back to Nora's, to the little room that smelled of thyme and open windows, and I placed the bread on the table. I didn't cry. I didn't even tremble. I simply breathed. That night, I wrote one last page in my red notebook. It wasn't a record or an accusation. It was a declaration. I am not a ghost. I am not waiting. I have acted. I signed my name at the bottom in a hand that was still firm, and when I set down the pen, I realized that for the first time in decades, my story didn't end in someone else's house. It ended where I chose. That was my victory. Small, but absolute. And as I turned off the lamp, I thought of all the women who had swallowed their anger until it calcified in their bones, who had mistaken endurance for peace. I wished them courage. I wished them proof. I wished them their own morning of decision. Sleep came easily, without dreams. The world outside was quiet, and so was I. I had nothing left to wait for. The story, at last, had come home. I woke the next morning to a strange quiet, the kind that feels earned rather than imposed, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to brace myself before opening my eyes. The light coming through the curtains was soft and golden, like liquid honey, and it filled the room without the harshness of intrusion. I lay there for a long moment, listening to the steady rhythm of my own breath, marveling at how simple survival sounds when it's no longer an act of resistance. The previous day had been the kind of ending that doesn't demand applause, only comprehension. I had done what I came to do, spoken what needed to be spoken, closed the circle of years that had trapped me between obligation and invisibility. And now, there was only the long stretch of hours ahead, clean and undecided, a life reclaimed inch by inch. Nora was already in the kitchen, humming softly to the radio as she poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. She looked up when I entered, her eyes searching my face for signs of what the day before had cost me. "You look lighter," she said, handing me a cup. "That's because I am," I replied, and we sat together in companionable silence, 2 women on the far side of storms, sharing the simple miracle of uneventful mornings. She didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. She knew enough. There's a mercy in the way older women communicate, a language built on omissions, where silence carries more truth than explanation ever could. After breakfast, I stepped outside into the garden, the scent of damp earth and thyme rising around me. The roses I'd planted weeks ago were beginning to bloom again, stubborn little bursts of red refusing to fade before their time. I touched one lightly, careful not to disturb its balance, and thought how resilience isn't loud or defiant. It's patient. It's the slow, deliberate refusal to die before you've finished living. A few days passed like that, quiet and uninterrupted, until a letter arrived. The envelope bore Adam's handwriting, and for a long time I just looked at it, turning it over in my hands like an artifact from another life. When I finally opened it, the first lines trembled with hesitation. He wrote that the house felt different now, too large, too still. He said that Lisa had stopped hosting her book club, that the guests had become uncomfortable after everything that happened. He didn't apologize directly. Men of his generation rarely do. But between the lines, I could feel something fragile, a dawning awareness of the cost of silence. He ended with a single sentence that was almost childlike in its simplicity. "I don't know how to fix it, but I know it's broken." I folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of my red notebook, not out of sentimentality, but as record, proof that even those who refuse to see eventually begin to notice the dark. Forgiveness, I decided, would not be an event but a process, something that arrived slowly, like light creeping across a room. One evening, while I was sitting by the window reading, the phone rang. It was Kieran. His voice was steady but softer than usual, as if he was carrying something heavy with care. He told me he had been accepted to a university abroad, that he was leaving in the autumn, and that before he went, he wanted to visit me. "Dad doesn't know I'm calling," he said, almost apologetically. "He still thinks you're angry." "I'm not angry," I told him. "Just awake." He laughed, the sound I remembered from when he was small and tried to imitate the sound of the train from his picture books. "You always say things that sound like poems," he said. "Maybe one day I'll understand them." "You already do," I said, though neither of us spoke of what he had done for me, the recording, the courage it took. Some debts are too sacred to name. We arranged to meet the following weekend. The day of his visit was bright and windless. I baked the apple cake he'd loved as a child, the one Lisa had called too heavy for modern tastes. When he arrived, taller and leaner than I remembered, he hugged me so tightly that for a moment I forgot my age, forgot the weight of years. We sat in the garden eating warm slices of cake with our hands, laughing about nothing. At one point, he grew serious and said, "I listened to it again, the recording. I hate that I made it, but I don't regret it." I nodded. "Good. It's not the act of betrayal she thought it was. It's the act of witness. The world runs on witnesses." He looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, You're free now, aren't you? I thought about it. The way freedom had always sounded so dramatic in stories, like fireworks or trumpets, and how in truth it was quiet and grounded, like clean sheets or bread rising in the oven. Yes, I said. Finally. After he left, I sat outside until the sun began to set, the light turning the garden into a field of amber and shadow. I thought about my life, about the long years of being needed but not seen, about the way love had been weaponized into obedience, and about how easy it is for a woman to disappear inside her own kindness. But I also thought about the moments of grace that had carried me, the nurse's steady hands that once saved a stranger, the laughter of a child, the small rebellion of a single morning's choice. People think strength is built in anger, but I know now it's built in endurance and the refusal to forget yourself entirely. In the weeks that followed, I began volunteering again, part-time at the hospice where I used to work. The nurses there greeted me with warmth, some of them young enough to be my grandchildren, full of a gentleness that didn't yet know its own rarity. I found solace in small tasks, folding linens, reading aloud to patients who couldn't sleep, brewing tea for families waiting in the hallway. It wasn't charity. It was a kind of re-entry, a return to usefulness that belonged to me and no one else. Sometimes, when I walked home after my shift, I'd pass the bakery and buy a loaf of bread, just as I had on the day I reclaimed my life. The woman behind the counter always smiled, not because she knew my story, but because I was a regular. There's comfort in anonymity when it's chosen. One afternoon, as I sat writing in the garden, Nora came out with 2 cups of lemonade. "You've been quiet," she said. "What are you writing this time?" I smiled. "A letter," I said. "To myself." "For what?" "For later. So I don't forget that peace isn't a miracle. It's a maintenance." She laughed softly. "You always talk like you're teaching someone." "Maybe I am," I said. "Maybe I'm teaching the next woman who forgets that her life belongs to her." We sat there together until the sun began to fade, and for a moment I thought of Lisa. Not with anger, but with the detached compassion one reserves for those who never learn the difference between possession and love. I hoped she would one day look at her reflection and see what she'd become. But I didn't need her to. Some stories don't require redemption to end well. When I finally went to bed that night, the window open to the cool air, I felt an ache in my chest that wasn't sadness, but something older, like relief after holding your breath too long. I thought of the phrase she had once said, the sentence that had split my life in 2, and I realized it no longer hurt. It had become a relic, a fossilized cruelty that had lost its venom. I whispered it once, softly, just to hear it break in the air, and then I smiled. "They were waiting for the old hag to die," I murmured. "She didn't. She just left." That is how endings truly work, not with punishment or spectacle, but with the quiet dignity of departure. I am 82 years old. I live by the sea now, in a room filled with light and salt and silence. Every morning I walk along the shore, and every evening I write a little before bed. I have learned that solitude is not the same as loneliness. It is simply the luxury of listening to yourself without interruption. Sometimes, when the tide is low, I pick up small shells and keep them in a jar by the window. Each one is different, imperfect, shaped by endurance. Like me. And if some woman, years from now, finds herself being erased, I hope she remembers what I finally did. That survival is not endurance alone. It's the art of leaving at the exact moment they stop seeing you and learning, at last, to see yourself.